Welcome back to the hashtag Make Procurement Awesome with SAP Ariba podcast. I'm Scott Pezza, Director of Financial Supply Chain Research here in our Network Value Organization. And today I'm excited to have on the line Veronica Wills, Associate Principal with the Hackett Group.
Thanks, Scott, for having me back on. I definitely have a face for podcasting, that's for sure.
Well, audio only is how we'll go. So today we're following up. If the folks in the audience hadn't seen or aren't familiar with Hackett's working capital research, you should be, so this will be your introduction. What we're talking about today is Hackett's 2017 U.S. Working Capital Survey. So I wonder, Veronica, just as a starting point, could you give folks who may not have tuned in before just a little bit of a background of how the survey is set up and what it is you folks have been doing?
Sure, Scott. So the Hackett Group conducts the annual working capital survey as is implied every single year, and we do this for the U.S. population of publicly traded companies as well as Europe. And we look at the top 1,000 companies as ranked by revenue to understand what is happening in the world of working capital. How are companies managing working capital? How important is it to them? Where does it fall on their agenda? And how does this change maybe in light of certain macroeconomic factors such as interest rates? So we look from year to year to establish certain trends at a macro level as well as by industry. And part of one of the outputs of the survey that we do in conjunction with CFO Magazine is a bit of a naming and a shaming. And if you go onto their website, you can actually find this document where we pull out the top three, the leaders, as well as the bottom three laggards for each industry and kind of call out the difference in performance across the levers of working capital and the overall cash conversion cycle. So you as a company can see this is how I'm doing now, but these are how the top performers are doing, and this is how much opportunity I have to improve.
Great. Yeah, and I'll make the pitch as well. Anyone who hasn't picked this up yet, it's a great read, really insightful, lots of really good data. I know for some of the financial folks in the audience, as for myself as well, I'm a data geek, so it's really fun reading.
Highly analytical, yes.
Awesome. I should also mention, so this is the third session we've recorded with Hackett. If you want to take a look back in our podcast archive, we've got an introduction to the Hackett Working Capital Survey and a bit of a broader discussion of the whole cash conversion cycle. There's also a discussion of working capital improvement and how it's tied to profitability. Now, if you want to look forward, we're going to have, rounding this out, discussions focused on days inventory outstanding and days sales outstanding. But for today, DPO is the star. And as we'll talk to Veronica about, really the main driver in the year-over-year reduction in the cash conversion cycle. So I wonder, Veronica, could you give us a little bit of detail about what you saw, I guess at a high level, starting with the cash conversion cycle over the past year?
So from 2015 to 2016, what we saw was the cash conversion cycle improved by 1.5 days, or about 4%, and is now at 35.7 days in total. So, and let me talk about that in the component pieces, since it's an accumulation of changes within DSO, DIO, and DPO kind of combined to show that high-level view. But from a DPO perspective, as you said, DPO is the star that came through in our study. This is really where all of the improvement came from. So what we saw was DPO for organizations improved from 49.5 days to 53.2 days, which is almost an 8% improvement from the prior year. Now, that was at the expense of some other metrics. So on the other side of the coin, we saw that DSO deteriorated from 36.3 to 38.2 days, which is a little bit over a 5% deterioration. And we also saw that DIO deteriorated as well, just slightly from 50.3 days to 50.6 days, just under 1%. So this leads us to believe that the majority of organizations have focused on that one particular element of working capital, which isn't to say that they haven't made improvements in DSO and DIO, but unfortunately, as the focus on DPO has resulted in extended payment terms for supplier, this is just naturally going to have a direct impact on DSO unless you as an organization are also trying to improve the payment terms and conditions that you have with your customers. And this seems to be an area that many organizations are reluctant to step into, at least not at first.
And it makes a lot of sense. It's not a one for one, but knowing that on the whole, these large organizations are holding on to their cash longer, to the extent that, say, some of their suppliers are also within that group, you would expect DSO, right? You would expect them to be collecting a little bit slower
Mm-hmm.
because then the opposite side, people are paying a little bit slower.
That's right, and that's exactly what we saw. So this puts a little bit of pressure on companies to look at the efficiency of their collections efforts and make some improvements there to somewhat offset the extension of terms. Just because your customer's telling you that they're going to pay you on longer terms, pay you slower, doesn't mean at the same time that they're going to pay you on time. So you need to make sure that you're doing what you can if you've been forced to accept these extended terms, or have agreed to them, that you're doing what you can to make sure that your customers are now paying you within that agreed time frame.
Great, and it's also it's a little foreshadowing and a nice pitch for the upcoming session on Days Sales Outstanding, where I'm sure they'll dig into that in a bit more detail.
Yes, absolutely. We'll talk about tips and tricks that companies can leverage in order to offset this improvement that we're seeing in DPO that's having some negative consequences on the DSO side of things.
And now there is one area in DPO improvement where it's still in the context of today's conversation on the payable side of the house, which is supply chain finance. So if we've seen DPO going up, and as the survey notes, part of that is attributable to supply chain finance, where a buyer is paying later, but it doesn't necessarily have an impact, a negative impact, on how quickly their suppliers are receiving their cash.
That's right. And the mere fact that DPO is the shining star of this year's study tells us that companies overall are becoming more mature in the way that they manage their supplier payment practices. And part of that maturity or that growth does include incorporating or introducing financial instruments such as supply chain financing. And to your point, Scott, that allows a company to pay suppliers at the rate that they're comfortable with and that is required to be able to manage cash flow effectively, without really a cost to them. So it's the supplier that's actually bearing the cost, and they're bearing the cost based on what they're willing to pay for a faster payment, which actually could be cheaper for that supplier than making up or accounting for that cash flow delay by obtaining something like external financing, because their supplier might actually have a better credit rating, which allows them to kind of take advantage of that, and or they might be able to obtain faster payment by paying a discount to the interim third party that's at a lower rate than what you would pay for obtaining something like third party financing or a loan.
Exactly, and that's a great point. And I know we're going to return to supply chain finance in a little bit, but one of the things you mentioned, I think, will help set up this conversation a little bit, and that was maturity. That you do see an evolution in how different organizations mature and what it is they focus on and what they sort of keep in their toolbox. So I wonder, before we get to talking about some best practices and digging in a little bit more to best practices as specific to supply chain finance, maybe you can walk us through kind of the way that Hackett looks at maturity in the working capital environment.
Absolutely. So the center point, I think, of this DPO improvement, or of any DPO improvement effort besides supply chain financing, is actually looking at the payment terms that you are extending to your suppliers, that you're agreeing during the overall negotiation of the terms and conditions. So this is the center, but there are a few things that you need to do in advance to prepare yourself for success as you go down the path of trying to renegotiate and trying to get better conditions for yourself. So the first thing that we do like to look at is how efficient are your payables processes? Because if we're going to go to a supplier and we're going to tell them that we're going to pay them later, we need to be able to provide some sort of assurance that although the payment might be coming later, it is going to be on time in the absence of any sort of identified issue or dispute, which would be handled through some sort of a structured process, and I'll get to that in a minute. But we want to make sure that we're able to receive and process invoices effectively and timely, and that there is a structure for managing any exceptions. Part of this is understanding how long does it actually take from the time that you receive a supplier's invoice to the time that you can actually get it booked within your processing system. And this is typically a big eye-opener for a lot of our clients. They might find that it's taking 20 days from the time that the invoice is received, or maybe even the invoice date, to the point in time that accounts payable is able to actually book it as a transaction and as a financial commitment, which can be a bit of a concern because that is sort of indicating that there's a 20-day blackout period where you don't even know that you have this commitment coming due. So that's step one. And once you know that there's a gap, you have to distinguish between, is the gap being driven by the supplier's practices, or is it being driven by some inefficiencies within your own internal organization? Suppliers have been known to have processes that may result in a document, a bill, that would have a supplier invoice date that is received into the customer's AP department, or in our case, our client's AP department, many, many days later that can't really be accounted for by a mail float. And this could be because they're doing batch invoicing and they're backdating the invoice to the time that they were able to recognize the revenue, or maybe their invoice processing is so inefficient that it's actually taking them several days from the time that they've created the document to the time that they actually can get it in the mail or transmitted electronically. So that's one portion of a delay to posting. And then the other portion is problematic as well. And this is where it's entering your organization timely, but it's taking you a number of days to actually get it into your system. The primary driver for this usually is because the invoice is landing on somebody's desk. Maybe it's the original buyer or requisitioner, and it's not getting to AP in a timely fashion. So once we've ironed out all the reasons for this, we would then kind of move into setting up our process for determining what sort of new payment terms should we target for suppliers. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but once we've done that, we would then segment customers into certain categories, which would dictate how we negotiate with them. And there is a large bucket of suppliers that fall into this category that we call tactical, that would be recipients of letter communications. And we want to take advantage of that letter communication, not just to communicate the terms extension, but also any changes to the way that we process invoices that they need to know about, so that we're not bombarding them with different communications, but that we're providing all of the changes at once. So at that time, we would also indicate to them where the invoices should be sent to appropriately in order to make sure that they can be processed efficiently. So this might be some sort of a central AP transacting location, for instance, and we're letting them know as well that we are going to be tracking the number of days delay between the supplier invoice date and the time that it is booked into the system, and any portion of that delay that is attributed to any of the supplier's practices, they would be penalized for in a way. So if there's more than, and you would define a grace period, but let's say 7 days, if there's more than a 7-day delay between the supplier invoice date and the day that it's actually received, then we would calculate the supplier due date based on that receive date rather than based on that invoice date. Because we don't want to penalize ourselves and have to make up for any delay that was driven by the supplier and is thus outside of our control.
Definitely, and I think it's a great sort of step-by-step look at how to improve things, because you can have a great, say, discount opportunity, but if you're not processing invoices fast enough to capture them, that opportunity is squandered.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah, so getting your house in order first makes a lot of sense. That's also a great place to pause our conversation for this episode. We'll pick back up with the second half next time around. So thank you to Veronica Wills of the Hackett Group for getting this conversation off to a great start, and thank you to everyone for listening in. This has been the #MakeProcurementAwesome with SAP Ariba podcast. For the second half of this conversation, stay tuned to this channel by subscribing on iTunes or Google Play. And for more information about SAP Ariba, please visit us online at ariba.com. Have a great day.